Adam Sterling is the director of the Divestment Task Force, and this week he's a movie star as well, because he's one of the 6 subjects featured in Darfur Now, which is in theaters in, what, 12 U.S. cities?
I think, and a number of Canadian cities as well.
And it tracks 6 people trying to, through various ways, help the situation in Darfur. Specifically, you've taken on the issue of divestment, which I think a lot of people have heard the word. Maybe they have an idea of what it is, but why don't you kind of explain what that means and what you guys are trying to do? So
we developed a model which we call targeted divestment. The first part is to identify these companies. Who are the companies, the foreign companies that the Sudanese government relies on to turn their oil reserves into revenue and to fund the military and the genocide? Primarily they're oil companies, Chinese, Malaysian, Indian companies. Then the next step was to trace those companies back to our investments. And we looked at our state investments. For example, in California, the state invests over $300 billion in international companies. And millions of those dollars are invested in these companies in Sudan. So then basically we developed a law which requires the state to write letters to these companies and say, you have 3 months to basically get out of Sudan or substantially change your behavior. And if you don't, we're going to sell our investments and bring the share price down in your company. This was a tactic used during apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah, that's kind of the Hall of Fame example of divestment, and also kind of started on American college campuses. What are the similarities? What are the differences? What lessons do you draw from that?
Sure. One of the biggest things that we looked at, we really were inspired by the South Africa divestment campaign, but we looked closely at what worked and what didn't work. And one of the things that we focused on was unintended consequences. How do we target those responsible while still protecting those that we're trying to help, largely the innocent civilians in Sudan? So one of the things we did, instead of targeting all companies in Sudan, we just targeted those problematic companies. So we don't target companies involved in the agricultural sector, because that's the highest employer in Sudan. Right. We don't target companies involved in the humanitarian industry. Again, so really focusing on those responsible. For example, another thing that we learned from the South Africa divestment movement is that we had to have something in our laws that would allow the divestment to end. Unfortunately, the South Africa divestment, a lot of those laws are still in the books today. For example, in Massachusetts, they still have a law against investing in South Africa. So one of the first things we did was put a provision in our bill which would basically overturn the divestment once the genocide had ended.
And who determines when it ends?
The U.S. government. So 12 months after the date that the federal government, either the president or Congress, determines that the genocide has ended. Also, if the U.S. government lifts their own federal sanctions on Sudan, then the divestment would end as well.
Yeah, it's not just states, it's colleges, it's other small groups. How far along in the process are you? Are you 20% there, 80% there?
Well, it's difficult. It's tough to gauge. We are making progress now. Actually, most recently, New Mexico, Governor Richardson ordered the state to divest, making New Mexico the 22nd state to divest. So
you were just saying this just before we started recording, that some of the publicity of the movie seems to be spurring some action, and maybe Governor Richardson, a presidential hopeful.
Absolutely, it's interesting. So Governor Richardson, who's been very vocal on Sudan, he traveled to the region, helped facilitate a ceasefire that ultimately failed, but he put a lot of time and energy into it. And for some reason, he just wasn't paying attention to the divestment issue. And Darfur Now is opening shortly in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there was a lot of publicity being organized around the film in New Mexico, and we got a few phone calls, and it turns out today, actually, he sent a press release ordering the state to divest.
So you started in California, you were a student at UCLA. How did you get into this avenue, this specific?
Yeah, absolutely. I was definitely not what you would consider an activist. We had this part of our campus called Brew and Walk, where basically every student group goes through the center of campus and every student group is out there passing out their flyers. And this was my junior year, and I had just perfected the art of walking from one end of Brew and Walk to the other without taking a single flyer. I found myself in a course on African studies, and we learned what happened in Rwanda in 1994. I grew up, I learned about the Holocaust, and that was my kind of connection to genocide, and I had no idea that Rwanda had happened. I mean, you've got close to 1 million people dying in 100 days, and it blew me away. And so shortly after, news came out about Darfur, and a few of us started a group and just started putting on events.
But why divestment? It's not a very sexy avenue to stop genocide. Maybe not the most obvious.
Yeah, it didn't start with divestment. We definitely didn't wake up and say we're going to start a global divestment campaign. I think our first goal was just to get people to come to our meeting. And the first meeting, 4 people showed up, and it was the 4 of us that started the meeting. But it just, we wanted to be effective. I think maybe we were just ignorant in that we didn't kind of think about, how difficult or how the bureaucracy would be, and we just kind of looked, what are the pressure points? We didn't think we had that much influence, so we looked at who did have influence. And after a couple of months of research, we found that there's these foreign companies that just the Sudanese government is relying on, and how can we influence those companies?
Yeah, I'm curious how much you think you can affect those companies, though. Would getting all 50 U.S. states, what does that do? What's the end game?
So the way we really mark our impact is how have we affected company behavior. We target about 36 companies, foreign companies, and in the past year and a half since the divestment movement's taken out, 8 of those companies, huge foreign companies that we've engaged with, have made either the decision to, 1, leave the country, or 2, adopt substantial political and humanitarian programs in response to the Darfur crisis. So, our impact, we're targeting these companies, and I think the best evidence is the impact we've had on those.
A counter argument that I know you've heard, and I'm sure you disagree with, which is that it's kind of an unwinnable battle because you get one company out and someone else is going to take that oil out of the ground, and it's kind of an endless battle that you maybe can't win.
Sure, and that was it's the unintended consequences. Warren Buffett said, we push this company out, what next? A couple of things. The first is that, the way we've targeted our approach is that we're not just pushing companies out of Sudan, we're pushing those kind of worst actors. So if a company that we engage with, that we've targeted, is willing to adopt, political responses, meeting with the government of Sudan, humanitarian programs, those are the types of practices we want to kind of encourage. But it's companies like China National Petroleum and PetroChina that are unwilling to do any of those things. There's really no worse alternative. Second, and one of the arguments that Warren Buffett made was that if we push, let's say these Chinese companies are the worst. If we push them out, then Sudan, the Sudanese oil company, is just going to take over.
Yeah.
Well, that's just wrong, because if you actually look at the way oil works in Sudan, the national Sudanese oil company, Sudapet, doesn't have the capabilities to do what these Chinese oil companies do. Yeah. So that's actually not possible. So really, these Chinese companies, they're the worst actors.